Hello, everybody, all you homebrewed Christianity deacons. And if you didn't know you were one, you are now one, because we ordain all our listeners here at Homebrewed Christianity, where we bring you the best ingredients, ideologically speaking, for you to brew your own faith. We don't want to think for you, we want to think with you. And today are two mini interviews, two 30-minute interviews back to back for your listening and theologically reflecting enjoyment. First is Jack Caputo, and Jack Caputo and I are talking about his upcoming book coming out this October, Hope Against Hope. It is a philosophical, theological autobiography, reflection on his own journey throughout his life, his career, his faith. And then we're going to talk to Dr. Adam Clark, Associate Professor of Theology at Xavier University. And he and I are going to be talking about religion, race, the Black church, and all the rising racial tensions, Black Lives Matter, the acts of white supremacist violence, the role of forgiveness in the midst of it. We're going to talk about all of that, both of them, on the podcast today. But before we jump in, I just want to tell you that this podcast is sponsored by, you guessed it, Subverting the Norm. That's right, Subverting the Norm is sponsoring the podcast because Subverting the Norm is like the thing all the cool kids are doing this November of 2015, November 5th through the 7th in Springfield, Missouri at Drury University, also sponsored by Phillips Theological Seminary. Friends of the podcast is Subverting the Norm. And at Subverting the Norm, you have political perspectives on postmodern theology and church practice. It is a packed, full nerd fiesta. And there you're going to get to hear from Cameron Carter of Duke University, Catherine Keller, Catherine J.C. is in the house, Alton Pollard. I'm really excited about him. I haven't seen him and talked to him in a while, but he, was a demon deacon for a while. Jack Caputo's going to be there, and Peter Rollins is going to be there. Catherine Sarah Moody's going to be there, who just had a brand new book, Radical Theology in the Emerging Church, come out with Ashgate. So if you're wise, you're going to go find that book. And anyway, it's going to be a real exciting time. And I just found out that Grace Ji-Sun Kim's going to be there. Yeah, that's right. Writing the Holy Spirit book for the Homebrewed Christianity book series. And she's going to be there. So just come on out. And when you do, use the code HBCSTN, and you're going to get yourself a discount on your ticket. HBCSTN, you get a discount. Not only that, if you use it, then I'll know, and I'm going to buy you a pint at Mother's Brewing Company right there in Springfield. And if that wasn't enough, Jack Caputo and I are doing a pregame. That's right, on the 4th of November. Jack Caputo and I will be doing a theology nerd boot camp. We're going to do a little day-long, super nerdy. I challenge you to come. I mean, it's a straight-up dare. It's going to be an intense exploration of what philosophers mean when they say God, and how that's changed over time, what it means for theology and religion and practice and community. And we're going to look at Aquinas, then to Hegel, then to Derrida, and theologize about that philosophical journey all day long. It'll end with drinks, and you'll get a chance to have a selfie with Jack Caputo. You're welcome. You're welcome. That's right. Anyway, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy Jack, then Adam. Head on over to homebrewedchristianity.com. There are tons of ways to connect, like Twitter at Trip Fuller, at homebrewedxnty, Homebrewed Christianity. Anyway, Facebook, there's a page. Review and rate on iTunes and Stitcher. If you're going to buy any of these books, click through a Homebrewed link and we get a kickback. And also, if you are part of the Homebrewed community, the people that, love the podcast, want to bring progressive Christian theological excellence out on the line of the webs, well, if you're a member of that, then make sure you check your email, because coming up is the first Epic Reads group. That's right. If you are a Homebrewed Christianity elder or a bishop, then you're a part of this year-long class going through epic reads. First up, Jürgen Moltmann's Crucified God. In a couple weeks, we have the introduction to Moltmann, and Scott Paith is a Moltmann scholar, and he's joining for the introduction lecture. And then the following month, we're reading Crucified God with Philip Clayton. We're going to go through the text, and then the following month after that, you're going to get a live video stream of me and Moltmann talking. And if you're in the group, you get to ask questions, and I'll ask them to him. So you're welcome. So sign up, join the Homebrewed Christianity community, which is homebrewedcommunity.com. Support the podcast, gets cool perks and all that kind of stuff. All right. It was great to talk to you. Now, listen to me talk to my friend, philosopher, weak theologian, Jack Caputo, and he talked to me while he was on vacation in the Jersey Shore. So he's in a great mood. Buckle your theological safety belt. Boom. Hey, Jack, it's always good to see you.
Good morning, Chip.
Oh, now, Phil, you're going to ask a question at the end. I was just giving you a heads up. I always ask what people that are here if they want to ask questions, and then people stare at me. But if Phil Snyder can't ask you a question, I'll kick him. All right. So, Jack, I just got to read your upcoming book, Hope Against Hope, Confessions of a Postmodern Pilgrim. Not only did I love it, but in it, you did something that philosophers don't normally do. You actually told your story. So maybe we could begin by talking about what a philosopher's doing when they begin to tell what they're thinking about God and mystery and life, while also being that intimately personal about turning points in their own story.
Well, that's a good question. That's one of the differences between the humanities and the sciences, although even that's probably too simple, is that what we're doing is not merely a profession. It is a profession. It has protocols. It has standards. It has its own rigor. But over and beyond that, or more deeply than that, it's a vocation. It's a calling. And my own work as a philosopher is not just my work, it's my vocation. And this word vocation is a good word because I literally began my professional, academic, intellectual, spiritual life with and in the setting of a religious vocation in a Catholic religious order. That's where I encountered philosophy for the first time, and encountered this mix of philosophy and theology, of religion and academic life that is where I've passed my entire existence. And so from beginning to end, this has been a matter of a vocation for me. Now, for the most part, professionals can't let that out of the bag. Professional academics cannot come clean about that and speak from their heart and write in a way that reflects that kind of deeply personal life, their own interior life. But I can, right? Because I'm retired. I mean, there's nothing they can do to me now. They can't take away my tenure. They can't fire me. There's nothing anybody can do to me now. So I've been using this time in my retirement to speak more in a more heartfelt way. I mean, I was always, well, not always. I mean, I started doing that at a certain point back in the 90s. And I used to advise my graduate students, don't write like that. Don't talk like that. Or at least don't do it until you're a tenured full professor, because the academy doesn't like it. And it wants you to, and this is not a pretense. I mean, it wants you to perform the role of a scholar, of a researcher, of someone who is defending claims and making arguments, and has to have recourse to the demands of academic protocol. But it's more than that. It's deeper than that. And you can't let that out of the bag, at least not too soon. And so now I can.
When I was reading the book, I kept thinking that throughout the narrative and the development of the ideas, you'll have these moments where this whole new dialogue partner, a whole new question impacts and changes your own trajectory. And I'm interested in thinking back to the early ones, like the discovery that you were going to be a philosopher of religion and invested in it. And like you only people that fall in love read Aquinas. Like right about the second volume is where you know if you love it or not. And then or the discovery of hermeneutics and Heidegger. Like, what could you, when you're reading back through the book after you've written it, what was it like to think back to those moments where your imagination got turned in new directions?
Well, you mentioned dialogue partners, and my intellectual biography is really a series of 3 dialogues, and you mentioned the first one already, and that is Aquinas, and that's an enduring legacy for me. I've been arguing with our good friend Pete Rollins about what someone in the Belfast meetings called his crypto Calvinism. And I just love that. I thought that was a great expression, because there's an awful lot of stuff going on in psychoanalysis that reminds us of, being born in sin, and being in total depravity, and instead of a priest, we get a psychoanalyst. Well, those of us who grew up on Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas are completely insulated from that, because Aristotle had this very healthy, robust sense of the natural world, and Thomas Aquinas picked it up. Thomas Aquinas did not have the same sort of Augustinian guilt, and sense of sinfulness. He thought nature was lovely, and if you beat up nature, you're beating up on the author of nature. So why beat up on nature? And he thought that grace made things even better, So there's a side of me that has this same classical Aristotelian Thomistic sense of the robustness of nature and the vitality of the world that God created, without looking at it in a dark and morose way. So you don't have this. I mean, of course, Thomas has a sense of original sin, but he doesn't think that it's the last thing you would have ever heard Aquinas say is that human nature is totally depraved by sin. It's the last thing he would have said. And that's an enduring legacy for me. And it's part of the version of phenomenology and hermeneutics and deconstruction that I embrace is not a subjectivistic interiority. It's a sense of what Heidegger called being in the world, our engagement with the concrete world, with life in all of its vitality. So the natural dialogue, the next step that made sense to me after I began to emerge from that Catholic world was Heidegger. It was the phenomenology that Heidegger proposed to us did not count Descartes as its predecessor figure, but Aristotle. Why was that? Because Heidegger was a Catholic. He was a Catholic. His first 25 years of life were spent as a Catholic, as a Roman Catholic, and then he moved on to Lutheranism, and then eventually he moved on to becoming Heidegger. But it was Heidegger always said the greatest phenomenologist of antiquity was Aristotle. And the predecessor figure for him is Aristotle, not Descartes. He was a great critic of Descartes. So that Augustinian, Cartesian, Lutheran, Calvinist, Kantian thing, it's not me. It's not where it's not the metaphysical side that I embraced as a young man.
Well, I'm looking forward to telling Pete that you're correct and he's wrong again.
I'm working on it.
Well, you used a phrase, and I'm interested in. You said, well, and then Heidegger became Heidegger. So when did Caputo become Caputo?
In the third part of radical hermeneutics.
Where it's even more radical?
where I speak in my own voice. That I finished the second part and I thought, well, that's it. The book's over. But then it kept looking back at me and it said, no, it's not over. There's something missing. And what I realized was missing was a section in which I would set forth what I thought myself. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier. There's a point at which you're really not authorized to do that in the university as it is currently constructed, which is so deeply professionalized that people are literally, their livelihood depends upon published work and peer-reviewed work, which is of the utmost sobriety. And speaking in their own voice rather than as a scholar of what someone else said is something they hesitate to do. But at that point in my life, I was 45 years old, which is about the time, by the way, that Aristotle says we interiorize all those principles and we can act on our own. I was 45 years old, and I, in the third section of the book, spoke in my own voice and described what really would be the project of the rest of my life. That is the question of ethics, the question of religion, and the question of the humanities and the sciences. So there were 3 chapters there in that book, which laid out basically the project that would occupy me for the rest of my professional life. So it was then. It was in my middle 40s. It was at a point when professionally I was a tenured full professor, and I had discovered Derrida. The difference between there were 3 masters for me: Aquinas, Heidegger, and Derrida. The only one that really moved me, motivated me, pushed me into speaking for myself was Derrida. The other 2 were masters of such monumental proportions that my efforts were directed towards understanding them. But I was not quite empowered by them as so much as I was overpowered by them. It was Derrida who, I like to say, loosened my tongue. And then at a very crucial point, he began to write about Augustine. And in the process of writing about Augustine, mentions that his name is Jackie. His real name on his birth certificate is Jacques, Jacquie, Jacques, or just Jackie. And that, of course, was a moment. I mean, that was a transforming moment for me, because that people called me Jack, but when I was a little boy, they called me Jackie. So this book that we're talking about, Hoping Against Hope, begins with Jackie. And it ends with the other Jackie, what I call in the book, the other Jackie. And my life ended up being a kind of dialogue between Jackie, who grew up in a world that was as deeply Catholic as you could imagine, American Catholic, and emerged from it, as did the Catholic Church in general after Vatican II, into the contemporary world. And I sort of, moved along with all that. So the book is, so at this point in my life, it was sort of irresistible to start framing things like that. And then the other thing that has to be said is that Tony Jones kept prodding me to put more of that in. So the earliest version of that book was, it had that beginning that we've just talked about. It began that way. And then I sort of dropped it and went on to the theory. Not theory set up in a very abstract, high level way, as if I were writing for academic peers, but theory that I was trying to present in a concrete way. But Tony said, no, you drop Jackie, you've got to get Jackie back into this conversation. So then I revised it much more heavily in an autobiographical direction and threw out some of the theory or condensed it. So the final result is in no small part the result of the prodding of Tony Jones to bring out this story along with the theory.
Well, I mean, it's very rare that, philosophers tell us about themselves, but the fact that you become human during it, that's amazing. It's rare that we end up coming across like human beings, because it's the theory, and even us trying to communicate theory to a wider audience, people go, well, where does that have traction in my life? Where does that kind of connect to what's actually going on in my world? And I thought that concepts you had developed in the weakness of God and the insistence of God, that their biographical origin and things like that became really clear in the book. I'm very excited about sharing it. And one thing we haven't talked about is the title. It reminds me of a certain saint named Paul talking, and but you aren't talking about heaven. So I'm interested in what the Pauline hoping against hope is that you're exploring in the text.
Yeah, when my Orthodox critics come after me, I like to say that I've written 2 books whose titles have been are direct quotations from St. Paul. The Weakness of God is from, of course, as you know, from 1 Cor 1. And Hoping Against Hope is from Romans. So I've twice now used St. Paul for the titles of my book. I think that the characteristically postmodern virtue is hope. It's faith too, if you understand faith not as something creedal, but as a kind of deep being seized by reality and the sort of, as Tillich likes to say, in the depths of our being. It's faith. I mean, define faith like that, but it's hope. It's the sense of the future, which seems to us right now so overwrought with technology and absolutely daunting technological transformations of communications, like the one we're engaged in right this moment. And just having sent a spaceship out to the outer limits of the solar system, the world is it's uncanny, in the philosophical sense of that word, something uprooting and strange and enchanting, but also scary. So we need to be turned towards the future is to be turned towards the future with hope. But in radical theology, you don't have the traditional hardware of hope. You don't have a firm, metaphysically grounded God who is a personal agent who's going to make sure that no matter how bad things get, it'll always turn out well. I mean, the very nature of radical theology is to say, look, that's a crutch. That's a sort of, Bonhoeffer would say, immature way to think about Christianity. It doesn't work like that. It's much more unstable. It's risky. Life is risky business. And so hope is hope, not in the more classical sense where it really has a foundation that you can point to and that gives you some sense of security. But hope is hope against hope. Hope is hope in a situation where there are moments when we think it's hopeless. And so St. Paul at that point, I think, is being an exquisite deconstructionist, because deconstruction, my favorite way to describe deconstruction is that it's the affirmation of the possibility of the impossible. So when do things get to be what they truly are? Well, only when they're impossible. So when is faith really faith? Well, when it's incredible and it's hard to believe it. That's when it's faith. Otherwise, it's just a likely probability. And the same thing is true of love. I mean, that, in a way, the most characteristic thing of all in Christianity is love. And Jesus defines love in a very Derridian way, I would say. That is, as the possibility of the impossible. That is, when is love really love? When you love what's unlovable, when you love those who hate you. And same thing is true of hope. Hope is hope when it's beginning to look hopeless. So the classical theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, faith, hope, and love, seem to me to have a deeply postmodern resonance to them, because they enter into the uncharted waters of the impossible. They're not the sort of stable virtues of Greek philosophy, prudence and justice and temperance and fortitude. They're the very unstable, risky, traveling out into the deep where the ice is thin, and the venturing into the abyss, the groundless. So what are the grounds of hope? Well, a kind of groundlessness. The grounds are groundless. That seems to me to be the virtue both of postmodernity, well conceived, not thought of as a kind of frivolous pluralism, and also of religion, which is why religion and postmodernism, for me, always end up running into each other and converging.
Yeah, that's great. So we're going to let a couple people ask questions. Phil, come here. You've met this man before.
I have indeed. Phil, how are you?
Doing well. Doing well, Jack. How are you?
Good.
Good to see you.
We're on vacation at the Jersey Shore, and I've taken out some time so I can talk to you guys, which is as much fun as vacation.
The last time we all saw you on TV like this, you were watching the Phillies. Like a row.
That was the beginning of the vacation. We got and the Phillies, talk about hope against hope. The Phillies are on a 4-game winning streak. There's the possibility of the impossible for you.
I'm a Baltimore fan, so I'm hoping that somehow Cole Hamels will land in Baltimore.
I do too. I'm with you.
Very good. Okay. The good thing about Trip is he gives you some fair warning if you're supposed to ask a question. I've got a couple for you, and I would just whichever one you want to pick up on, or if these go together. The one I was going to ask you initially, you've already touched on a bit. Here in church circles at a denominational convention, obviously there's a lot of language about the name of God. And sometimes you get the impression whenever folks want to talk about postmodern theology, perhaps in ways that you've articulated it through the years, if you unplug the name of God from some sort of supernatural supreme being or something along those lines, and then you invoke the name of God, say in your preaching, that somehow you need to have your fingers crossed behind your back, because if it's not the God of supernatural supreme being, then it couldn't begin to we can't begin to speak about the name of God. And so I would be interested in you sharing a bit about the way that the name of God is conceived in your work and thought, with some of us preacher folk in mind.
Well, of course, you've written the authoritative. I think you've written the authoritative book on this subject. So I will first of all refer readers to your wonderful book about preaching.
You're very kind. Thank you.
What I think the name of God is the name of a certain form of life. I think it's the name not of a being in the sky, or even which is a sort of sarcastic way to put it, but even in a sober metaphysical account of God's transcendence. I don't think it's that. I don't think it's the name of an agent or who does things that save us at the last minute, or who fails to do things which leave us scratching our heads and rushing to the theodicy books to figure out why he left us in the lurch. God, the name of God is not a person like that, and not an agent who intervenes in things, but it's a name in which and under which a form of life is galvanized. And therefore, it's a very powerful name. I don't think it's a projection in the sense that Feuerbach described it. I think it's much more like what Tillich called, being seized by the ground of being, And I think it's a way in which we name that being seized, being held captive, or being swept up in the power of something. But it's a powerless power. It's not a being that's going to come riding over the hill and save us. It's not a being who is watching us with arms folded and a stern look on his face, figuring out who he was going to reward and who he's going to punish. All of those, I think, are mythological and even blasphemous ways to think about God. I think the name of God, in my language, the name of God weakens into the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God weakens into a form of life in the world, a mode of being in the world. I have a book coming out, another book coming out, not the one we're talking about right now, called Does the Kingdom of God Need God? And the answer is, in the sense of a supreme being, no. The kingdom of God is God. The kingdom of God is God's unfolding realization in the world. It's a form of life. And consequently, it's something that we affirm unconditionally, not because sorry if we don't do what God says, or really happy if we do, but because that form of life in itself has laid hold of us, taken hold of us. It's what Heidegger calls a form of being in the world. It's a form of being in the world where the world is under the sway of what's going on in the name of God.
Very good, thank you. Trip, do we have more questions?
Hey, Jack. Quick question for you. I guess for those of us who maybe would also self-identify as postmodern pilgrims, I feel like the posture of theopoetics has been a gift, not only linguistically in giving us better language to talk about what's going on, but also to kind of give our souls some rest for those of us who might have been bound to certainty for a long time in our faith, you know? So I'm curious for you, are there any practices or postures as you've kind of developed this theopoetic approach to philosophy of religion that for you have been, you know, kind of a consistent mode of contemplation or kind of the bien oui oui that you talk about? Like for you, how do you cultivate, is there any spirituality left in that discipline? Or I'm also curious as to what you might see moving forward if there's a community that could parse out theopoetics together. I know Pete does some stuff in his kind of communities and stuff, but I'm curious, again, just how you might parse that out for yourself, and then also how you see that theopoetics, that gift moving forward, done in community.
Well, there's a lot there. One of the things I try to do in this book is to show how what this all means is a set of practices, I single out in particular practices of hospitality and of forgiveness and of the works of mercy. I single out in particular the hospitality and the gift. And I try to show how religious communities are that's sort of the central nervous system of religious communities. When you talk about religion without religion, when religion is able to twist free from its preoccupation with creed and doctrine and orthodoxy, what it comes down to is our communities of hospitality and communities of the gift. So that's why I always like, and this is, I'm not playing to the crowd here, but that's what I like about the disciples. I mean, the disciples had that same sense of practice-oriented forms of life rather than creedal formulations. It also means, the other thing that your question brings up to me is that I want to keep what I'm calling radical theology in interrelationship with and in communication with the confessional traditions. I'm not engaged in the drive-by shooting of confessional religion, because I think that as a matter of fact, the only place you find radical theology is in the more radical voices inside the confessional communities. It's the only place that actually exists, except for maybe a dozen and a half academics at the AAR who meet once a year. Apart from that, minuscule shadow of reality, the reality of radical theology are in concrete confessional communities that have managed to break the bonds of creedalism and orthodoxy and form communities, or open communities, communities of hospitality and the gift. So like that. I mean, if we had another, I do focus the central part of the book on just that. Then after saying that, I say, well, then what do you need if that's what's really going on in the confessional traditions? What do you mean by God? What do you mean by God? And I say, well, that's when I say, well, God weakens into the community of God, and the community of God, or kingdom of God, and the kingdom of God weakens into these concrete practices.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering questions and hanging out with us. Let's get you and Phil, and we'll take a picture of you with Jack's giant head, because you're on a 55-inch HD screen, so it's always fun to get pictures of the people.
So I have a big head.
Yeah, I'll get next to each other. So oh, there, smile, Jack.
So awesome. This is a picture of us?
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Okay.
We'll send it to you. Oh, there you go.
Oh, I see what you did.
Yes.
Very good.
So while we're ending, why don't you tell us about all the exciting things that are going to happen in November when we're hanging out with Phil at Subverting the Norm? I thought he was going to ask that question.
You want me to tell you or Phil to tell you?
Oh, why don't you tell us what you're excited about at Subverting the Norm? For people that may not know, they're watching this video.
Well, I said to Phil in an email a week or two ago that I really thought this Subverting the Norm had, as Leotard would say, it links. It's really begun to get some traction, and people talk about it in between the meetings. And it's really becoming a place where a lot of all this good stuff is happening. And this particular lineup that he's got coming in the fall is particularly rich and more diverse than it's been in the past, because we got raked over the coals for being a bunch of white males sitting around talking about the other. So this time Phil made some sustained effort to make sure the other was represented. And you and I are going to do a little thing there on a little bit of self-promotion of our Fortress books. And then what?
I said it will happen. Don't worry.
It will. And it's a distinguished lineup of people, and a terrific forum for a lot of people from not just simply academic people, but people engaged in concrete ministries, to come together and interact in a language and a discourse that is, I think, quite accessible.
You want to do the code thing? All right, so Phil actually has a discount code for everyone at General Assembly that'll work both for us hanging out with us the day before and at Phil's church, and for the conference itself. So you can tell it, because I don't remember the code, Phil.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, this works for anybody who's at General Assembly. It's going to be good through the duration of General Assembly. And the simple code that you can use is STNGA, as in Subverting the Norm General Assembly. And this will get you a discount to the event with Jack and Tripp. It'll also get you a discount to the entire Subverting the Norm conference series, which truly is a one-of-a-kind event that takes place in the United States at Xavier University in Springfield, Missouri. An incredible group of people who come together from the scholarly world, from the world of the church, religious practitioners, folks who in established conventional kinds of churches, folks doing pub church kinds of conversations, just across the board, a great group of people. So the code to use is STNGA. And one last note, Jack, since you're going to be at Brentwood Christian Church, where I've been for about a dozen years, that's pretty exciting. I'm trying to talk our music person into rewriting one of the songs of ours I think I'm not good at music, but I think the meter will work where if we change a few of the words, we can turn it into what do I love when I love my God? And then there's a refrain of the people coming back. Is it justice that I love when I love my God? Is it love that I love when I love my God? So hopefully we'll have that together for you by the time you're at Brentwood Christian Church.
Well, we all have a footnote to St. Augustine for that one now, so don't forget that part.
Very true. I had to pay some money for my footnotes in my book because there are other people who can say them so much better than I can. So,
thank you so much for joining us, Jack.
It's my pleasure.
All right, that was Jack Caputo talking about his new book. It's about to come out this October, Hope Against Hope. Yeah, so if you thought that was good, then you should come too. The Theology Nerd Bootcamp with me and Caputo, November 4th, right there before Subverting the Norm in Springfield, Missouri. Go to homebrewedchristianity.com, find out details. Anyway, next is Adam Clark. Before we jump in, I just want to tell you something about Adam Clark. I met him at the American Academy of Religion. Adam Clark is a brilliant theologian, tons of fun, hilarious. He is one of the heads of the Black Theology group at AAR, and we had this, we had drinks and we were talking, and it was the first time I got to hang out, talk, and he was asking questions about podcasting, social media, that kind of stuff. And then we started talking about the gap between the academy and the church and how it's different in white churches and black churches. And then he started talking about really his concern and investment in connecting the dots between the academy and the church and his minister friends who are struggling with things differently than we do in the academy. And then somehow jokes started and we were having fun and then we became friends. So it was totally fun to finally have Adam on the podcast because we've been talking about it for a while. He had been a homebrewed Christianity listener before we ever met in person. So he's a deacon, but he's like super smart and awesome. And I can't wait for you to listen to this. All right. So here's Adam Clark. Like it. And then make sure you tell him it's awesome so that he comes back on again because I want to talk to him. And if for no other reason, then he's writing the Salvation book in the Homebrewed Christianity Guide series. Boom. All right. So just so you all know, Adam is one of my favorite nerd friends on the planet. And so I'm very excited to get to talk to you. And I'll try to ask shorter questions than when we talk on the phone so it doesn't go over an hour. But before we jump in, maybe you can say a little bit about yourself because it's rare that you have academics who are as invested in the life of the church as they are in their own academic careers and figuring out how to bridge it. And our friendship began having conversations about what is it like to take the best from the academic world and actually address and support and help people in congregations and in community. So how did you get a passion for academic learning and a passion for your faith and end up professor of theology?
Wow, the how question. I think my passion was probably spawned really in undergrad. I had a few mentors in terms of the campus pastor, Charles Rice, who's at Union University. He was a mentor of mine. Dr. Harvey Sandima, who's at Colgate University right now. He was another mentor of mine. And I think just religious intellectuals kind of cultivate. I was a philosophy major at Colgate University, and I was influenced by people who did kind of philosophy of religion. And it really cultivated my kind of passion for trying to handle the questions with both mind and spirit. And that propelled me to go to graduate school to pursue a theological degree. And I think it probably happened through the mentorship I received in undergrad.
And so, when you finished your PhD, and now you're an hour and a half or 2 hours away from us here in Columbus right now?
Yeah, about two hours.
And you're a professor at Xavier?
Yes, Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. There's another one in New Orleans, but I'm at the one in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Awesome. So one of the things that I was hoping we could talk about is just all the different energy and weight that's come up around race and religion in the United States, in all the rather horrific incidents have just been lining up and lining up. Is there a particular way that, or a question or a framing that you take into trying to unpack and address notions of race and religion in America?
Well, there's been a lot of kind of talk or thinking about the Charleston shooting that happened about a month ago, June 17th. And for those people might have heard about it, but there's a mass shooting that took place at an Emmanuel AME Church, that's African Methodist Episcopal Church, in downtown Charleston, South Carolina. And the thing about it, it happened during a prayer service where 9 people were killed by a gunman. And one of them was the pastor, who was a state senator, Clemente Pinckney. And he was killed by a white male, 21-year-old Dylan Ruth. And he did it with the intentions of starting a race war, right? So there's been a lot of kind of thinking in the Black theological community about, man, if you could get killed in church, we already had driving while Black. Then we had shopping while Black. And now we have praying while Black. That is even dangerous to pray while you're Black, right? So here we have this kind of mass shooting that happens inside a church. And that type of presence of evil and suffering engendered so many responses in the Black community that it really sharpened the focus on how race functions, has a meaning-making function within the United States.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of assumptions when you're talking to your peers in the study of religion, if you did not grow up with the Black church experience, what kind of assumptions are there from scholars who should know better or ask better?
Well, here, it's the best way to kind of respond to that. Well, when we're trying to analyze this, we're trained as theologians, but we have to get to the pre-religious or the pre-theological. So that means kind of interrogating the realm of desire and imagination, right? So we have to talk about the very conditions for knowledge, right? Like part of what we do in theology, we talk about shifting knowledge paradigms, like the Enlightenment, big shift, radical shift, postmodernity, a big radical shift. So when we even talk about race, we have to talk about radically shifting paradigms of knowledge, even before we do our theological work, right? So a lot of times people are trapped in old paradigms. So, I teach a Black theology class and I teach an African religion class. And a lot of times I spend a lot of my time trying to unpack, faulty, deficient, and discredited paradigms about race before I can even get to the theological task. And that takes a lot of work because that should be done in sociology. That should be done in political science. But I find myself having to do that work because nobody else does that work. And then I have to get to the theological task. So that could take a lot of time. And I find that many people have uncritical assumptions about race that really lead to more divisiveness and violence than actually life togetherness, right? So we're trying to find ways to think about race in ways that are enhancing and ennobling and not things that actually lead to clash and conflict.
Yeah. And one of the things I was wondering, and we haven't even talked about this before, but that the murderer was like a college-age student. Sure. And when it comes to questions of identity, race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, class, all these things are so in flux and impacting adolescents on through college when it comes to their identity. How do you see that part of just our biological growth impacting essentially large numbers of young white men erupting in violence in different situations?
Wow. Let me answer that question this way. One of the ways when I wrote about this and thought about this, I looked at it in terms of what was the social imaginary that Dylann Roof was operating and inhabiting, right? Like, so meaning that, how did he conceive and see the world? This is not just a function of formal education, right? It's not just something you get taught in school. It's something that you inhabit, that you inherit. So that's why there's been so much, talk around the Confederate battle flag, right? Because that represents not just a symbol, but a social imaginary, how you imagine life to be, what life together looks like for you, right? That's a pre-theological symbol, or it's a theological symbol that informs the way people see the cross, right? Like the Confederate battle flag comes first. It represents a certain type of whites-only social imaginary that actually interprets what the cross means to a whole lot of folk. So part of like the response to this, some people say, well, we're just dealing with, symbols here. Why we put so much emphasis on the flag? But symbols are really, really important because they shape the way, not just what's represented, but how we're orientated in time and space, right? So part of like the kind of response to what's happened is to really bring focus to what this flag means, what's the symbol, and how people are orientated around it. And there needs to be new orientation symbols or markers for people, white men of Southern heritage, to actually like talk about that I can honor my ancestors in a way that respects the life of other people.
Yeah, and I think that, I am a white Southerner,
right.
And often we don't recognize it as ancestor worship because that would be bad for us as Bible-believing Christians.
Right.
And I remember having a very powerful conversation with one of my professors, and she said, Tripp, you might help all the Southern white guys if they just took a black religion class. They would learn that ancestor worship's not only rooted in Scripture, but all the liberating movements within the church.
Right. Yeah, we call it, let's say, honoring the ancestors or venerating the ancestors. We don't worship the ancestors, but we venerate or we honor the ancestors. So, but it's a thing. I teach at a Catholic university. They talk about, a cloud of witnesses or the communion of saints. It's very similar to the African idea of honoring the ancestors. There's a real parallel. It's just Protestants have kind of not had that as an active part of their belief system. But there are other parts of Christianity where that's a very, very living thing within their Christian spirituality.
So can you unpack when talking about Charles Taylor's notion of the social imaginaries? Like, how would you take that notion and apply it to Reverend Pinkley, or even how Mother Emanuel functions in Black religion in the South? Because I kept hearing conversations, especially in California, where you're unaware, if you're native to California, exactly what it's like to be in the South, and to have individuals and churches hold such symbolic weight and power to them.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I didn't know too much about Reverend Pinckney before this incident happened. I was very impressed when I learned about him after death. But, my sense of it and some of the information that I've looked at, he was really a prophetic Christian voice, and he comes out of what Mother Emanuel is, a historic Black church that actually, is birthed out of the Black liberation movement. It was one of the earliest kind of AME churches. It was the home of Denmark Vesey, who was, a freedom fighter and led one of the, or actually plotted one of the largest kind of rebellions against the institution of slavery that was foiled. And it had a tremendous history. And after actually that was foiled, they burned the church down and they passed laws to actually suppress Black churches until slavery had ended. So the social imaginary of Reverend Pinckney came from kind of a deep social justice tradition that came out of the African-American Christianity. And, I think it probably had something to do, most people have some type of modification on King's beloved community, really, as looking at a type of America as a pluralistic democracy where life together is respected, equally in that sense. So I would imagine that would be at the center of his Christian vision.
Yeah. And one of the most powerful moments following the tragedy was the sentencing or the bell setting, where you had family members of the deceased offer forgiveness, and then others wrestle with it, and then you have a million different ways people receive that, from crying to anger, all within every spectrum of the church. So I was wondering if you could kind of help us understand theologically the way people could see the very act of forgiveness that soon, that quick, in so many different ways.
Yeah, that was interesting. And I had I made a Facebook post about that, and I had a lot of comments, both very favorable. But when what Tripp is speaking about, for those who may not be aware, is that less than 48 hours, when the bodies weren't even buried, during the sentencing of Dylan Roof, the family forgave the murderer, the terrorist, right? So, all over the newspapers and actually in the news, there was this kind of, they forgive the terrorists, forgiveness. And that provoked a lot of responses within the Black community. And on one hand, I'll try to articulate both sides as best I can, traditions of thought. On one hand, there was this kind of idea of, forgiveness comes out of this idea of agape, right? That enables us to love everyone, not because we like them, but because God loves them. So it becomes our relation. It's an impersonal kind of love. And agape doesn't distinguish between worthy and unworthy persons. It doesn't distinguish between friends and enemy, but it attempts to regard everybody as neighbor. And it's the love of God operating in the human heart, right? So that's the first kind of, and it's kind of a supernatural giftedness, in terms of that. It's not something that comes from human effort. And, people see that as kind of the mystery of faith, of how you're able to forgive. And I think that's the one that folks went with in terms of understanding, or that's the one that was kind of publicly accessible to folks about, isn't it? There's a beauty in being able to forgive. Now, there's been a history of love and forgiveness since the Civil Rights Movement, that Black folks are always forgiving whites for crimes of brutality, but yet we do not see the same equivalent response when white folks get murdered. For example, the Boston Marathon shooters, they weren't talking about forgiveness then. Or the beheadings of ISIS. No one's talking about forgiveness then, or that's not the dominant thing. So some people have come out and said, almost like kind of what Nietzsche critiqued Christianity, that this idea of forgiveness is more of a glorification of weakness, right? Or what Elijah Muhammad said, it's kind of a slave theology. It's a subservient form of religion. And that became the other idea, that somehow that Christianity doesn't allow us to have access to certain parts of our human selves that allows us to grieve and to anger, and that before the bodies are even buried, that there's a compulsory form of forgiveness. It's mandatory, and that forgiveness gets publicly associated with forgetting, right? So it becomes a cheap forgiveness, a forgiveness without commitment, a unilateral forgiveness that doesn't value Black life equally, right? So there was a kind of debate on my page between certain types of activists who saw this as a kind of cheap forgiveness versus folks who saw this as a certain supernatural giftedness, and this is what Christians are supposed to do.
Yeah. And what I find interesting in having that conversation is that when you and I were talking for a while about it, what even pausing to ask the question, did the forgiveness come too soon? Are we skipping over murder and ignoring it? Are we not pausing long enough to see our fingerprints as a culture on so many triggers, right? Just having that conversation made me think about the systemic issues around race and power longer than I would have if I just teared up at the act of forgiveness, one which I'm 100% sure I could not muster the words in that situation.
Right. And even like psychologists talk about stages. When I was talking to, Reverend Tony Lee about this, he was very, he told some interesting stories. He's a pastor at Hope Community Church in Maryland. He talked about that he's had members of his congregation who's had their sons killed. They were able to forgive the murderer and become a mentor. And he said that's how Christianity works. So he was very defensive and said, how dare you actually kind of critique the family for what they're doing in trauma. I mean, that should be sacrosanct. And my personal response was, yeah, you should not critique them. But the crime wasn't just to the family. The crime was trying to start a race war. So the crime was against all of us. So the family could do, my post was along the lines of, look, when you have such a devastating thing happen to you, you're trying to avoid turning into a pillar of salt, right? Like, so you might have to release the poison in you order to function. That's just something that to do as just a human being. It's like therefore, but for the grace of God go I. I mean, that's very difficult to handle. But on the other hand, how forgiveness functions publicly in the way we are socially related is that there seems to be a certain type of compensatory forgiveness that is applied to African American Christianity that's not applied to any other group in Christianity, right? So that becomes like a point of contention and suspicion about that Black people seem to be invested in the Christian project in the way that other cultural groups are not invested in that way. That George Bush was a born-again Christian, but he, went to Iraq, right? Had no qualms about that. And Boston, this is the most Catholic community in America, but you still don't have that. And Christianity, just to kind of finish this up, Christianity has two traditions. It has a nonviolent tradition, but it also has a just war tradition, right? And in the African American community, we seem to forget that there's a just war tradition within Christianity too. That's an option, and that's never seems to be available to African American Christian communities.
Yeah, and one of the things you hinted at, and we talked about it yesterday with Grace G. Sun Kim, is being attentive to the labels we use to create an other. And throughout the last couple months, be it from Ferguson to Baltimore to Mother Emanuel, there's been debates over what words you use to who. Is he a terrorist?
Yeah.
Is he a gangbanger? Like Fox News, is he a gangbanger?
Right.
But like, or it's a upper middle class white kid that had too much to drink. It's okay. It's just adolescence. And so when we're as ministers and people of faith, how do we learn to be attentive and hear the power dynamics of othering in the labels we choose for both victims and violators? Because when we leave those labels of othering in place, they come with power, even if we're not the ones who exercise it on the bodies of other people.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And that gets back to my first point about looking at the pre-theological assumptions that we have. And looking at, sometimes the epistemological precedes the theological, right? So in terms of doing that work, let me back up a little bit. Being someone who's in the academy and studies, theology professionally, theology is really in a disciplinary crisis, right? Like theology has been like faith-seeking understanding in terms of like Anselm's definition, but we really have to get to an idea of theology in the 21st century of looking at structures of meaning. What type of meaning structures? And we have to like broaden theology to look at how meaning structures, whether they be racial or structures of how we conceive our humanity in terms of that. So I think the church and communities of faith, and even people who do theology professionally, or even if you're a lay theologian in that way, we have to train ourselves to look at how I guess, certain types of labels and categories conferred meaning on human beings. For example, in this particular incident, when there's a Muslim act of violence, it's called terrorist. When there's a Black act of violence, it's called thuggery. But usually white acts of violence are like isolated, deranged individuals, right? There's nothing about white culture that systematically kind of spawns this, even though it's been happening historically for centuries, right? So part of it, there needs to be a marking of white culture as a particular set of assumptions and priorities, in the same way there's a marking of every other culture in that way, and try to interrogate that. And that's part of where this kind of, I guess, discourse on the Confederate battle flag comes from. It becomes from marking that and trying to interrogate that in the same way we've interrogated other communities.
Yeah, I was having a conversation earlier today with one of the ministers here who had come up, and he was talking about how he, I listen to homebrewed Christianity and stuff, and I really enjoy it, but it's kind of too forward on certain justice issues for me to bring it up in my congregation. And, I'm sitting there, I was like, did you hear the other stories you just told me? Like, they're very progressive, activist around economic issues, racial justice issues, and this kind of thing. And he said, yeah, well, white churches are just very different around sexuality. And a lot of times I want to be able to have more dialogue with more progressive white ministers and churches and stuff. But I think y'all make a precondition to almost everything having a rainbow flag around. And maybe we'll never get there because you won't hang out with us unless we have one around all the time. And I just don't know what to do about that. And he looked at me like I had some answer. And I was like, sorry? And you and I had a conversation similar about this, about friends that are in churches and are trying to wrestle with the issue while remaining in contact with congregations that are in very different places. How can we have helpful and really unifying conversations around an issue when our churches could be in very different places, and ones that recognize the integrity of the other? Because I feel like too many times we build up walls for one good reason, even if the reason's just, but then we miss out on friendships that could really impact us in so many deeper and bigger ways.
Yeah, you're really, putting your finger on it. I would say that, look, the central challenge of theology in the 21st century is the problem of difference, and how we conceive of difference and how we relate to difference, right? Like, it's not just, so it's both our conception of difference, how we conceive it. We could conceive it in ways that are incommensurate, and then how we relate to that. So we have to find, so this is where we're in a situation where all of our, and this is, I know you've done a lot of work talking about postmodernity on the Homebrew broadcast. And postmodernity really, talks about how the world has been marked by plurality and ambiguity, and all other sorts of ways that are really different from, the past. But there's another sensibility, in addition to postmodernity, as postcoloniality, right? Where it talks about, it's not just it's marked by it, but how the world is constructed, right? So if postmodernity are looking at Christianity as marked by ambiguity and plurality, postmodernity is looking at America as a theological construct, the modern West as a theological construct as well. So a lot of times we have to think about, like, for example, if we look at America as a theological construct, the two dominant theological dimensions of America is, one, the idea of American promise in terms of what it promised, and innocence. Part of the reason why people have such a hard time coming to terms with race in the United States is because theologically America is conceived as innocent on these issues. So therefore, there becomes a disbelief. And what I mean by innocent is that America is essentially good, makes mistakes, but always with the best of intentions. right? So if you ask someone, like, when was America ever wrong? Well, they might say, oh, Vietnam, but we were fighting the communists. Or Iraq, but we were fighting this evil dictator. But it's never like something that's embedded in the American character, right? Like, so Christians, if they really do believe in original sins and that things are embedded, they have to really have a much more kind of Christian realism about what's happening at the heart of America and look at what are these embedded structures that reproduce oppression, and not just think by passing a law that they're going to actually solve the problem of human relatedness.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was extremely wonderful. And thank you for hanging out with us in the digital universe.
Yes.
Do you have any last words, comments, or what you're working on or anything like that?
Wow. Well, I'm working on a whole lot of projects and 2 books, but I will mention that for you, I'm working on the idea of salvation, looking at the doctrine of salvation, which I understand to be the fullness of life, not just the afterlife, but the fullness of life. So I've been thinking about the idea of what is life in its fullness, and what is the fullness that Christianity brings, and also the type of meaning structures of looking at consumerism as a substitute idea for fullness and how we've been kind of been caught by that. But Christianity brings a kind of counter narrative that takes us to fullness and conceives of fullness in a different way.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to reading the rough draft.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you, Adam.
All right.